Amen. All right, church. So, going to be Luke 16. Still going through parables right now. We'll have a few more after this, and then we'll see where the Lord leads us to go next. But for now, we got a few more parables. Really, by way of introduction, Luke 16 is probably, in my estimation, the hardest parable in the Bible. I don't know if anyone in here thinks there's a harder parable to try to understand. There might be. I could be wrong. But I do think that this parable here in Luke 16 is difficult for a number of reasons. But one thing that you'll begin to see, I think, with today's parable, and as you guys can think of ones that we have already done, is Nick said it very early on when we started this whole thing, is parables at times can be difficult to understand simply because they can be difficult to interpret. But on top of that, not only can they be difficult to interpret, but we often bring difficulty to them because of our own understandings. We have our own preconceived notions about what things mean. And we're just a people not used, once again, also to story, to allegory, to metaphor. And so we often tend to dice things up so fine and chop them up so nicely that we have to know every word and we have to know every phrase to make it mean something. And that lends itself to what we're going to be in today. But as you can see, as we begin to read this, remember parables, they are stories. These are often metaphors, they're allegories, which tend to pick up on typically one particular reality or principle for you to take away from this. And though there's a lot of things here in Luke 16, that reality doesn't change, right? Just because we get to a difficult passage does not cause us to do away with everything that we've established before and then do something different with this passage here. The same principles are going to apply. We want to understand this parable on its own terms, and we want to also know that this parable was not given to confound Christians for 2,000 years and have no significance and no meaning for them. So this parable, though I think it is difficult, and as we work through it, I think you'll see some of the things as we begin to introduce some of the problems that typically plague interpreters as they come to this text. I do want you to know that I believe, obviously I'm preaching it, but I believe that there is a key insight and principle from this parable for you to understand. And you may be like, great, I feel like that's what preaching is every week. But if I asked you what the principle was, you probably would then go, okay, good point. So all I'm trying to encourage you at church is this is understandable for us. This is going to be understandable for us. So as we've gone through a few of these, right, some of these parables, here's what typically happens. The parable is spoken, and then there's a reaction from the crowd, right, including the disciples. They're very confused as to what's been said. And then Jesus will do what typically? He turns to his disciples and he offers explanation. So Nick's was a perfect example. When he went through the parable of the seeds that were sown, Jesus gives the parable, and then there's a brief momentary pause in the story. There's narrative that talks about the reaction to the story. And then Jesus' disciples come to him and they ask, Lord, can you tell us what that meant? Because we're lost like the rest of the people. But Jesus does a particular thing there. He doesn't turn to the crowds and share. He turns just to his disciples and he shares. And that's usually a very profound and key thing within the parables that typically they tend to work that way. Jesus will say something, the people are confounded, and then Jesus turns to his disciples and he begins to teach them what it actually means. But we also get some parables where Jesus gives the parable and then there's no explicit explanation given at all to the parable. There may be mention of the crowd's reaction to it, that they didn't like it, or they perceived it in one way or perceived it in another way, but Jesus just doesn't give us any explanation. And then this is, I think, where Luke 16 really kind of fits, is we're not given any explanation to this one. In fact, it comes amongst a number of parables where no explanation is given as to the interpretation of the parable. These parables just simply keep building on one another, and we're going to have to pay really close attention to the details within the story, I think, if we're going to try to catch on. Because though there's no explanation given, it's not as if Luke put all of the parables of Jesus together in this order and then said, that's just the best I could do. Right? Luke intentionally put these parables together. They're stacked together with one another, and it's very intentional. So our parable, though it has no explanation today, I think makes it a little bit more complicated, is going to be understandable if we are going to focus not only on the parable itself, but we kind of need to see what the context of where this parable sits among some of Jesus' teaching. But to just kind of add it on for you, this parable, he doesn't even turn to his disciples to give some kind of explanation when he does this. In fact, this parable comes as Jesus turns to his disciples, and usually when he does so, gives explanation. Here, just gives another parable. And so this one here in Luke, just really, it's kind of like the cherry on top of the parables that can seem confusing and have not much context to them. So I do think that adds a significant amount of work for us to have to go through, and by no means to add it all on. Commentators have been all over the place on this. I've probably read somewhere around 12 different commentaries, both old and new, to get some kind of understanding from other people of what they said about this passage. And I kid you not, out of all of them I read, though there were some similarities here and there, the variations on this parable were all over the place. I mean, all over the place as to what the parable has meant, or what it does mean, or what it's supposed to mean, or what you're supposed to get out of it. So I'm not trying to set us up for defeat. Just rather, I want you to consider, one, this is a difficult parable. Let's not act like it's not. I even, like earlier, I asked Michael what he thought, and he was like, brother, that's a hard one, and you've had a couple weeks to study. Why are you asking me? I just wanted to know. But just the point of it is most people, even good pastors and teachers of the Bible, have a hard time with this parable. So, by no means do I think we need to think that this is easy, but let's work through some of these, because as we go through some of the textual problems, and I'm going to actually highlight them for you because I want you to see the difficulty before we read through the whole parable, is there are some difficulties in trying to understand exactly what is being meant by certain phrases and by certain words here in this parable. And I think what we're going to end up seeing is that certain ideas and words have just been misconstrued, or at times just totally been misinterpreted in the context to lend itself to different explanations of this text. And so our goal is going to be this. We want to provide understanding for this parable. One, we need to be able to read the parable and take all of it in. So if our explanation for the parable is such, but we can't account for one verse over here, then we need to kind of question our understanding of the parable. So for instance, one commentator on here concludes that in verse 9, when Jesus tells his disciples to make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings, interprets this as using the wealth of the gospel to convert and to bring people in, while totally ignoring the fact that Jesus says it is making friends by means of unrighteous wealth. So I like the application, brethren, right? That's great. That's a glorious allegory right there. But it's not what Jesus says is the explanation of the parable. And so we have to be able to do that. Whatever we're going to say the parable means, we can't hit the conclusion to the meaning of the parable and not be able to answer it. We have to be able to account for it. So I think the first thing we need to do is we need to actually make sense of the language of the parable in order for us to begin to understand it. So all that simply means is we need to take the parable at face value. If Jesus says, I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, we need to be able to take that phrase at face value and make application for what Jesus is saying right there. Second is going to be this. We need to be able to see that once again, and hopefully you guys have seen this multiple times, these parables, this is not Jesus walking in his ministry for 3 years, and he just doesn't really know what he's doing. And then, he thinks of a good story here. And then he remembers something he wanted to tell them here. This is not Jesus' grocery list of parables where he's just picking and choosing at random what he wants to tell. Jesus was intentional. Jesus is a traveling preacher. Jesus knows his crowds. I mean, Jesus does he not know the heart of the people that are before him? He knows very well how he's telling these stories. And so we need to look, one, at the language, and two, we need to see how that language sits here in Luke 16. And I'm going to show you guys, hopefully, between Luke 15 and the end of 16, really help us place this parable of the dishonest manager. So I think if we can do both of those things, then we can actually begin to ourselves, what's the application? Because no doubt there's application here for us. 10 to 13 will somewhat touch on what Manny touched on last week, but I really want to emphasize a few different things as far as what I think the application is. But in order for us to rightly get there, let's actually be able to understand the parable, because the parable was given to the disciples so that they would obey verses 10 to 13 in Luke 16. So if we're going to understand the root of the obedience that Jesus expects and demands, we have to understand what the parable meant for the people receiving it. Right? It does us no good to just take 10 and 13 and ditch the rest of the parable. The moral obligation upon the disciples to do the things in those verses is dependent upon the parable. If you chuck the parable, what else goes with it? The obligation to obey. So we have to have both together. And I think as we look through this, we'll be able to make connections so that, church, what I ultimately want for us is to apply the principle of the parable to our life. But I want us to be able to do it rightly, and I want us to do it in a way that is holds up the integrity of where we find these commands here in Scripture. So let me give you a list. Actually, so we're going to read it first. Let me scrap what I said. We're going to read the passage, and then I want to give you a list in the passage of some of the textual things that you hopefully should hear that are like, that's a weird thing to hear Jesus say. So Luke 16, I'm going to start here in verse 1. We're going to go all the way to verse 13. And then I want to flesh some of these out for you. So Luke 16, beginning in verse 1. He also said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager.' And the manager said to himself, 'What shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I've decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses.' So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He said, 100 measures of oil. And he said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. And then he said to another, 'How much do you owe?' And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said to him, 'Take your bill and write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. One who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much, and the one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you to true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." Amen. So, you probably heard a number of things in that parable that sound very odd. And among all of those things, I think a couple of things arise for us that we're going to have to answer as we go through the text. So I just have 5, and they go here in order. Notice first that we have to deal with the fact that the manager over this house is called dishonest. He's a dishonest manager. Or you can put right there, This man is an unrighteous manager, and yet the master approves of his actions. So we have in the parable a man who is morally bankrupt. He's a dishonest man, and yet he's approved of his actions. Okay? We got a difficulty there. 2, we need to ask, who are the sons of the world? And why are they being highlighted to have a characteristic that is greater than the sons of light? Why does Jesus highlight sons of the world and do so in a way in which highlights a characteristic that they have that seems to be of greater value and worth than that of the sons of light? To add on to it, why does Jesus tell his disciples to make friends and don't miss the words that follow, by means of unrighteous wealth? Why does Jesus tell his disciples to make friends by means of unrighteous wealth? Not through, simply through, but by means of unrighteous wealth. 4, what are the eternal dwellings? What on earth is these eternal dwellings? And 5, why does the passage seem to end on a weird note of Jesus just giving us a couple of one-liners and then ending, right? It's kind of a weird ending. Think about it. Jesus gives the parable, brief explanation, and then it's be faithful in little, so you be faithful over much, and don't love money. Don't serve two gods. You can't serve two masters. Serve one, not the other. Does anyone think that ending is weird? I think it's weird. I read it and I'm like, I don't know what to do with these verses. Maybe I'll just skip 10 to 13 because I don't know how to put these together. It's a weird ending. It's a parable, boom, boom, point, point, done. It's like, okay, what do we do with those? So hopefully I've convinced you there are a number of things in here that seem at the outset kind of difficult. This is just, what is Jesus even saying? What are we supposed to take from this? And I'll tell you, here's probably the number one most common explanation for this parable. And there is some truth to this, but I don't think this is the full intent of this parable. And it's usually in this, that the parable is simply teaching us not to mimic the dishonest manager in his character. We don't want to be dishonest people, but rather we are to mimic him solely in the fact that he was shrewd, right? He was or clever, or he was wise. If you don't know what shrewd is, it's just being clever, being wise, using wisdom. And now we are to mimic only that part of the dishonest manager and what he did. But the problem, once again, with this, like I said, there's a lot of variations to the explanation of this, but typically that is the explanation of this. But the problem is what we read in verse 9. Church, it does not answer what he says in verse 9. It does not answer the fact that we are to make friends for ourselves by means of unrighteous wealth. It just doesn't answer it. Yet it could tell us to be shrewd in our dealings with people. It could tell us to be wise. It could tell us to be clever. But it doesn't explain why Jesus tells the people to make friends by unrighteous wealth. And the resulting of it, the two seemingly paradoxical things, make friends by unrighteous wealth so that you'll be received into eternal dwellings. It just doesn't answer it, church. So let's look at a couple of things here. I'm going to give you first a couple of contextual clues so that hopefully my understanding of this will not just simply be plausible, but I think is the way to understand this passage. So there's 3 points of contact here that I want to give you. And this first one's going to be just a chapter back in Luke 15. And the reason for this is, like I said, this parable here falls in line amongst a number of parables. This is not the first parable Jesus has spoken in this section. Jesus has given the parable of the lost sheep. He's given the parable of the lost coin. And then probably the parable par excellence that everybody knows, parable of the prodigal son. Even the world knows that one. And then we hit the dishonest manager. So you have an entire chapter devoted to, I think, what is seemingly the same theme as people have argued before, that the parable of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and then the prodigal son are all telling the same story, just they grow in their degree until you get to the parable of the prodigal son. But notice the beginning. The first 2 verses set the context for, I believe, all of the parables till the end of chapter 16. So look at Luke 15. We're going to read verses 1 and 2. And Luke writes for us, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him." This is Jesus. And then the reaction, verse 2. "And the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, 'This man receives sinners and eats with them.'" That's important. Those two verses, though, are probably skipped over, read over so fast, I think are vital in understanding what he is going to say in the parable of the dishonest manager that we just read. Jesus now has tax collectors and sinners coming to draw near to him. In the religious people of his day, Christ's own people, the Pharisees and the scribes, grumble as they see this, and they say that this man receives sinners and eats with them. So remember that. They see the people draw near to Jesus, and the Pharisees conclude what? He receives sinners, right? He's receiving people. He's receiving people. Now, Luke 16. This is obviously what we've already read, but I don't know if you guys caught this because we just read Luke 16 kind of out of context. Who is he talking to in Luke 15? Disciples, yes, but seemingly a pretty large group of people. You got tax collectors, sinners, and you also have the Pharisees and the scribes standing there because they can see what's going on, and then inevitably Luke is recording what they're saying, and then Jesus begins to give these parables, I think, in light of what they're saying, right? Because think about the flow of this going into some of these parables. This man receives sinners. Well, what is the whole point of the lost sheep? You go out for it. You go out for that lost sheep. What's the parable of the lost coin? You do everything you have to find that lost coin. And what's the parable of the prodigal son? Rejoicing that the lost son, the unrighteous son, comes back home, right? And the father receives him. So in 16, you have a shift. Very slight, very subtle, but this is no longer to the crowds. So this is typical, like I said at the beginning, this is typical of what Jesus does. But usually, that when he turns to the disciples, what does he do? He explains, he interprets. And here he doesn't per se. He doesn't offer what I would say is an explicit explanation, but I think rather he gives a parable as an explanation to the reaction of the Pharisees. I think he's given a parable as a response, an explanation to his disciples of what they ought to beware of. And 16:1 tells us, he also said to the disciples. There is a shift right here in who he is. There is a primary audience that ought to hear this. And though 16:14, if you look, Luke 16:14, though other people hear this is directed to his disciples. Because if you look in 16:14, what is the reaction after the parable of the dishonest manager? It says the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things, and they ridiculed him. So there's a context right here for this parable. There's a lot front-loading it, and then there are things that follow it that I think help us understand why Jesus gave the parable here. So I want you to have that context in mind. Tax collectors and sinners are coming unto Jesus, drawing near to him. That's the same language used of people drawing near in the Old Testament to God's temple. Right? They're drawing near to Jesus, the righteous one. And the Pharisees and the scribes mock him because he would have the audacity to hang out with sinners and tax collectors. So here's the parable itself, because I think this is Jesus's response, almost in a backhanded way to the Pharisees, but a response more for the disciples on how they ought to think. On how they ought to think in light of how the Pharisees and the scribes think. And I entitled this, and maybe you'll start to see this as you hear it, but I've entitled this Received into Eternal Dwellings. And I think you'll see that as we parse some of these verses out here. So here's the parable then itself, given that context. You have first this unrighteous manager. Now, I keep using unrighteous for a reason. So there's really not much for me to say for these first couple of verses, right? Verses 1 through 8, they're pretty self-explanatory, right? There is a lord or a master over all these possessions, and he has a manager for him, or you could translate that ruler of the house. This is actually a ruler of a house that this man has, and what gets brought against this manager. There's a charge that gets brought against him. He has failed in his duty to perform the master's bidding. He has failed in his duty. It is brought to him, to this ruler, that the man was wasting his possessions. So this man had been given possessions by this master, and he was to be the ruler of this house, almost this organizer of this house, to deal out this master's possessions, and he just fails to do so. Completely fails to do so. The charge is brought to him, and notice that in the story, there is not even mention of a pushback on the charge. It's like the charge lands, and he's brought before the master, and there is no arguing with the master before it. The charge is clear. And the point of it is simply that this manager has no room to make a case. He knows he has not done well with his his master's possessions. And so hear what he says. So he gets called in to account, and he tells him, "What is this that I heard about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager." So this man is essentially fired. He is done with his term. He is no longer going to manage this master's goods. He's no longer going to stand in over his master's possessions because he's lazy and he wastes it. But notice the response of the manager. Notice his response. The manager says to himself, "What shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me?" And his excuses: "I'm not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg." But in light of his present circumstances, the man is about to be cut off. In essence, what he is saying, if the man's losing his job and he's not willing, or he says he's not able or strong enough to dig, or even able to beg because he's too ashamed, well, what happens to you if you're not even willing to stand out on the side of the road and beg? Yeah, your good is dead. I mean, you're not even just a homeless person at that point. It's like a dead man walking. If you're even too ashamed to beg, you are as good as dead. And I think that those two things are given on purpose. I think it's to display what is kind of hidden, the reality of this manager's plight. But that even within his plight, cleverness strikes. It's like a spark comes. He says, verse 4, "I've decided what to do. In light of I can't do this, I'm too ashamed to do this, I'm as good as dead, I've decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses." So notice that the whole reasoning for what the man's actions in the parable are is found in verse 4. The reason he goes and does what he does is because he has in his mind, if I go and do these things, people will receive me into their houses. Right? That's the logic. If I go and do these things, people will receive me into their houses. Well, what does this manager go and do? He starts cutting bills in half, right? He starts going out and settling accounts really quickly. I mean, imagine this. Any of you have ever had any kind of debt, and the person that you owed to comes and knocks at your door and says, "How would you like to pay half?" You better believe you're taking them up on that offer, right? I would. I'll tell you right now, I would. I'll take them up on that offer. So the man sees, in light of doing these things, what's going to be the result? if he shows mercy to these people in canceling some of their debt, mercy will be shown to him when his master comes and removes him from management. His time is short. Because notice his master tells him, you're going to be removed from management, but he's still going around and he's dealing with the master's accounts. His time is short. It is short. And in that short amount of time, he has but one option so that when he is removed, he might be welcomed in to these people's houses in whom he has helped. And I think that's important because I think in light of Luke, of what Luke has said in a lot of his parables, going through over and over again, is there is a looming reality upon Israel and upon Jerusalem that their time is coming up short and they will be called to give an account for what they have done with their master's possessions, and the master has found them to be wanting. And there is short time for the people to get in a hurry, to repent and do what is right. And I think this parable is coming in light of that. It is coming in light of the fact that this master of this house is taking away this manager's right over his possessions, and he is going to leave him out to dry. And that there's little time for this manager to figure out something to do. So as we get through this, he starts cutting these bills in half. And then verse 8. Verse 8 is where our trouble begins to start. So the master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness or cleverness or wisdom. And then here we get explanation. So now we're no longer in the story. We're no longer in the parable. We have now left the parable, and Jesus here is actually commenting now on this brief parable. He's given meaning right here. Because you can see in 7, you got the quotation marks, and in 8 it ends. So this is Jesus now giving the commentary on this parable. And he says that the master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. So here's a couple things that are going to start us off here in verse 8 that I want to begin to walk through. And like I said, tying ourselves into the broader context here of Luke 15 and Luke 16 of why I think this parable is first and foremost being related to Jerusalem and Israel and to the disciples here. And it's because there is an account about to be accounted for. There's going to be a lack of God's people at this time being called to give account, and their possession of the master's things is about to be removed. And Jesus is now turning to his disciples, and I think he's giving the parable in light of what came before. Because what came before this? He's talking to everybody, and he's hearing the grumbling, and he's hearing the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they don't like that there are going to be people who are lost, unrighteous people, sinners, who are coming in and being welcomed by the Father. They don't like hearing this, and so he turns to his disciples and he's warning them. He's warning them about what's going to happen. And he begins to comment then on what's going to unfold. And right here in verse 8 is you have the first thing mentioned. The master commended, and this is the first time it's actually used. We don't really know that he's a dishonest manager until we get here to verse 8. All we know of before is he doesn't handle his master's possessions well. Right? He seems to be lazy. Or at bare minimum, he's not doing anything to make sure that his master's possessions are not only taken care of, but that he receives a return on them. And so here, Luke says that the dishonest manager is commended for his shrewdness. Now, this word right here, dishonest, is an interesting word because it's not used a whole lot. And in fact, Luke uses it the majority in the New Testament. And I want you to hear how it often gets translated in Luke. So this is Luke 13:27. This is just a few chapters back. So you got to think, this word is following in a context. So we want to pay close attention. Ooh, okay. Luke used it in 16, and he just used it a few chapters back here in 13. We want to pay attention to how he's using it and who he is using it against. Who is he applying the word to? So this is Luke 13:27. And he says, "But he will say, I tell you, I do not know where you come from. Depart from me," and then here it is, "all you workers of evil." That's the same word right there. Same word translated. Here translating it as evil, but even the translation of it as evil is the makers of any Bible, as they're translating it, is kind of their own flavor of the best way to understand that word. Really, the word simply means unrighteous. It just means unrighteous. Now, that can come across as doing evil deeds. That can come across as being dishonest. But at the heart of the word, it is to be unrighteous. And in Luke 13:27, he is speaking about Israel's looming judgment. He tells them in 26, "Listen, you're going to say this. We ate and drank in your presence." He's putting words in Jerusalem's mouth. He says, "Listen, we ate and drank in your presence and you taught in our streets." But he will say, and this is now God saying to them, "I tell you, I do not know where you come from. Depart from me, all you workers of unrighteousness." So here in Luke 13:27, you get the same word tied to the same idea, speaking of the people as being an unrighteous people on whom they are going to be judged. Judgment is going to befall them. And so here, the master commends this unrighteous manager for his shrewdness. But notice why he commends him here for his shrewdness. It's because the manager had a goal, right? The manager understands his own plight. He is going to be let go and be good as dead. So he's commending the dishonest manager not for his dishonesty or his unrighteousness, but at least his wisdom to see, if I'm let go by the manager, I will die. And he is at least wise enough to do something to avoid that judgment. And so he tells them, this master, he commends at least this unrighteous manager for his shrewdness. He at least could see somewhat of the writing on the wall, right? He could at least see it, even this unrighteous one. And then he gives some explanation. Right here, he says, "For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light." So here I think he is now furthering this argument here in verse 8 of the master commending the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. And I think he's going to do this by highlighting a particular characteristic of a certain generation in light of the disciples and who they are. So here in verse 9, when he says, still in verse 8, when he says, "For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation." You have in your Bible translated this, just like in mine, it says, "For the sons of this world." And many of you probably, even if you don't have a Bible that has a bunch of footnotes in it, you at least have a few reference notes. And you probably have a number there. And if you look down or in the gutter, wherever your notes are in your Bible, there is a number there that corresponds to that one. And it says Greek age. Right? It says age. So that you could translate this second part of verse 8 here, "For the sons of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light." And here's why I think that would be a better translation. First, it's easier for us to think about this in terms of world because it makes it easier for us to think and how to apply it. We hear the sons of this world versus sons of this light, which means anybody in the world now versus Christians, boom, right? You get what I'm saying, right? That ties together really nice, right? That sounds great. But if you think about him saying this, he is giving an explanation of what just came before, and he's telling his disciples this, and that would be a weird thing for him to tell his disciples this in the same way that we typically think of world, in the same way that we typically think of translating that as just referring to our present world, our present reality, when in fact, I think he is first and foremost, not that it doesn't address us, but that it first and foremost addressed the disciples. And he is saying then that for the sons of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. The question that would befall us if we say that it's age instead of world is, now we're getting away from this universal kind of statement where we think about world to one that is more particular when we use the word age. The natural question that should pop up in your mind is, what age is he talking about? What is he referring to by the sons of this age? What would Jesus' most immediate context be referring to? And I would argue that he is talking about the present age in his day, towards the very people he has been talking to, towards the very Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes that he's been railing against in Luke 15, and to his disciples whom this parable is addressed to in Luke 16. So I think he is saying for the sons of this age, the current age at that time, the one in which Israel and Jerusalem and the Jews stand as the beacon and center of God's people and God's temple and God's dwelling place. And he's saying that the sons of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. So I think the contrast he's making here then is this. I think he is tying both things in verse 8. The first half, he's talking about this dishonest manager who he commends him for his shrewdness in what? At least having the wisdom to see what's going on around him and do something about it, lest he be destroyed. All right, do you see that? The master commending the manager is for his shrewdness in going, I can't dig, and I'm too ashamed to beg, which means I'm as good as dead. And he's at least wise enough to go, I can do this for the purpose that when I am let go, I'll be received into somebody's house. And then he says, that second half of verse 8, I believe he's now applying this general principle of this dishonest manager in the parable to the sons of his own age, of Jerusalem, of the Jews, of Israel as a whole, and says, for the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And here, I don't think he's applying that to simply, I don't think here now he is commending these sons of this age. Rather, I think he is telling his disciples that even the sons of this age have some sort of wisdom and some sort of cleverness in the way that they deal with their own generation than even the sons of light do. And I think what he's inferring is, then you do. Right? Because what is verse 9? It's then he starts commanding them, and I tell you. So I think Jesus here is highlighting the fact in verse 8 that the dishonest manager, he's somewhat representative as the whole, who is going to be let go, does something at least clever enough to take care of himself in light of what's coming. And then he connects the dishonest or the unrighteous manager to the sons of his own age, and he's telling the disciples that even the sons of that age of Jerusalem of Israel are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than even the sons of light. And here I think he is now drawing upon the fact, and he is actually dealing with them now in a negative way. But he's doing so by highlighting that even in their condemnation, and even in the fact that the sons of that age are being called shrewd in dealing with their generation, I think he's looking at his disciples and telling them, even they are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than with the sons of light, than you. And I don't think here Jesus he's trying to purposefully make them feel bad, as if the disciples somehow were not being clever or not being shrewd or not being wise. I think he is now telling them how they can then be shrewd and clever like even the sons of that age are with who? Their own generation. See, even in Israel, even in unrighteous Israel, they at least knew how to deal with their own generation. They knew how to deal with their own people. And he is now calling his own disciples into account here to tell them how they ought to engage, others. And it's going to be different than the way the sons of the previous age dealt with their own generation. Because how are those people in that age constantly talked about in Scripture with dealing with their own generation? Are a lot of good things said about the Pharisees and a lot of good things said about their righteousness towards other people? They're not. They may be shrewd, and they may be clever, and they may be wise in how they do it, but they are not just. They are still unrighteous in dealing with their own generation. And now Jesus is going to tell how the sons of light, his own disciples, ought to behave in light of this. So there's where I kind of think this context is. And so look here, verse 9. So verse 9, he says, "And I tell you," now he's speaking directly to his disciples, "And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings." So what's going to be ironic here, and what's going to be interesting here in verse 9, is Jesus is going to start using these similar words and phrases, and he's going to use them like he did earlier in a negative way to now describe what the disciples, the sons of light, ought to do in a positive way. So in verse 9, he tells his disciples to make friends by means of unrighteous wealth. So, but as you hear that, get out of your mind, first and foremost, what popped into my mind all the time, is Jesus is telling them to go get rich, right? Sometimes you hear that and you just miss the fact that what Jesus is actually commanding them to do is to do what? Make friends. Making of friends is the primary action that he tells the disciples to go and do. He is not telling his disciples, go into the world and simply accumulate a bunch of unrighteous wealth for yourselves and be filthy rich. He literally says a couple verses after that, you can't serve God and money. So I understand how we have to get past that, but we just take it at face value with what he says. I tell you, make friends for yourselves. By what means? By means of unrighteous wealth. So these making of friends right here, and by unrighteous wealth, I think he's actually tying these two things together here, right? Because earlier, as we were reading, there's this unrighteous manager, and he really is unrighteous. He really is unjust. He is not a righteous man. But we know that him using that and talking about that word does not have, it doesn't simply find its own placement there, but even back into Luke 13, we see that he uses that of that generation there as well. And in Luke 15, as we started this, as we gave some context to this section, who is drawing near to Jesus as he's about to give these parables? It's tax collectors and sinners. It's tax collectors and sinners. They are drawing near, and the Pharisees are grumbling. And so Jesus lays the attack on the Pharisees and the scribes. Then he turns to his disciples, and I think this is what he's doing. I think he's telling them to do the very thing that the Pharisees and the scribes were laughing at and actually ridiculing and grumbling Jesus for doing. Jesus was allowing tax collectors. He was allowing sinners. And I think by doing so, he's allowing unrighteous wealth to come near, to be around him. And these Pharisees and these scribes are complaining about this and grumbling about this. And here he tells his disciples, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth. Now, here's one clarification that we ought to have here. I don't think that what Jesus is saying here is go make friends by means of unrighteous wealth by doing unrighteous things. I think he is talking about the making of friends and doing so through the means of unrighteous wealth, meaning worldly wealth. Just like these tax collectors and these sinners were not thought of in any sort of imagination to be righteous or holy or a part of God's people or anything that could belong to God's people, he is now actually telling them, go out and make friends with these worldly people. Do so through unrighteous wealth. Do so with unrighteous people through these worldly friendships. Go out and make friends with them. Go do so by means of unrighteous wealth. Obviously not living unrighteously, not going out and doing unrighteous things, but by going out and engaging in worldly activity. And here's why I think that. Because of what follows, of what the conclusion should be. Because friends, I'll be honest with you, if we don't take that at face value of Jesus saying, go make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, with the second half, then I think we just destroy what Jesus is saying here in verse 9. I think we have to understand it that way because here is the purpose clause, the so that clause. So that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. Do you catch the where the action is happening here? Who's doing what to whom? There's a purpose for the disciples to go and befriend these unrighteous people in their unrighteous wealth, in their godly, worldly areas. It's because money will fail the disciples and would be a lesson to every one of here in you. Money will fail. He says, so that when it fails, a guarantee from Jesus, the unrighteous wealth by which you make these friends fails, right? So it's not about the money. He's making it very clear. It has, at the end of the day, when the goal is in sight, it is not about the money. It's about making of friends so that when the money fails, the friends that were made through the means of unrighteous wealth, may receive you into the eternal dwellings. Does that sound odd? Thank you. About to get into the explanation. Who does the receiving? Because here's what I'm reading. Some commentators are talking about, well, here's how you make friends by unrighteous wealth. You give your worldly money to help worldly people out. Right? So you lend money to them. Almsgiving is a big thing in Christian history of helping out the poor and the needy and the widow and the orphan. But it doesn't say that. I like that. And I'm all for that. But it doesn't say that. It says that when the money fails, it's not that you can then bring them in because they remembered how nice of a person you are in giving money. It says that they receive you. They will receive you into eternal dwellings. So why are these friends who are made through dealings in worldly affairs and worldly money receiving the disciples? Why are they the ones receiving? And why on earth are they receiving them into, with the definitive article, the eternal dwellings? So here's the first part. I think if we understand what is being said here by eternal dwellings, we will be able to understand why the disciples are being received by these friends, why they are the ones passive in this action. And so it's going to have to do with this phrase, eternal dwellings. So there's two things we need to deal with here. First is, okay, we could ask what the eternal dwellings are, but why does it just not say dwellings? Why does it not just say, well, listen, go make some friends out there. If this looming judgment is coming, you're at least going to be wise enough, shrewd enough as a son of light to go out into the world, make some friends so that when it comes, boom, you got a place to stay. But he doesn't just tell them, go and do this so that when judgment befalls you, when it befalls Israel, you got a nice place to stay. Because not all of them did when that happened. And if he wanted to say that, he could have used the same word that he did back in the parable. So hold your finger right there at 9. Go back to verse 4, right here in Luke 16. When that dishonest manager is considering his plight, he says, I've decided what to do so that when I am removed, people may receive me into their houses. All right, so you're thinking houses, dwellings, okay, maybe it's very similar, but the two words here are actually different. So what Jesus is telling them to anticipate is not the same. This is not just some temporary earthly house that they're being received into, and more importantly, we have the adjective in front of dwellings here as eternal. So it should tip us off to what the manager was looking for in the parable. What the disciples ought to be looking for as they're received by these friends is something way better than simply being received into somebody's house pending judgment. So we need to ask why eternal and why eternal dwellings. I want to deal with the adjective first. So eternal right here. So if you go back and you read the Old Testament, what is it said of a lot of the things in the Old Testament about how long they're going to endure? How long was the Aaronic priesthood supposed to endure? Forever. What's it called? What's another word for forever? Yeah, eternal. Dang it, that didn't work. Sometimes you try to fish and it doesn't come back. Everlasting. Yeah, everlasting. So forever, or a long time. It's going to be around forever. What about circumcision? What kind of ordinance was it? Yes, eternal. Thank you. It was an everlasting ordinance. My whole point is this. You go throughout the Old Testament and you see that phrase slapped on to a number of things. I'll give you a few. If you're a note taker, I'll give you a few. All the Old Testament feasts, including Passover, Exodus 12, 14, and 17, they are eternal feasts of God. They're everlasting. That's what God calls them. The olive oil and the lamp in the tabernacle, Exodus 27, 20 to 21, everlasting or eternal. Special garments of the priests, Exodus 28, 43. These things are eternal. They're everlasting. Priestly offerings, ritual washings, the Old Testament Sabbath, everything literally in the Old Testament given to God's people to either do for worship or to do in their practice to live before God is called eternal. It's called everlasting. And it's the same word that we find here in Luke 16 when he says that they may receive you into eternal dwellings. So the thing that we have to ask then is this. All of those things that I just listed off, Are those all things eternal? No. That doesn't mean they lose their significance. So in one way, yes. Doesn't mean meaning is lost from them. They're gone forever, never to have any sort of significance again. But do we practice any of those things? Do any of those things have any binding relevance upon us now? No, they don't. How can they be called eternal then? And that's because listen, Scripture can do this. And I think Scripture is very clear when it uses words like this. So the Old Testament, when the Old Testament is written in Greek, which would have been the main language of Jesus' day among Rome, among even the people. So if you go into the New Testament, right, you read the book of Acts, like Michael read that passage in Acts, and the disciples are there, they're talking in the Jerusalem Council, and they quote Scripture. What would they have quoted? Would they have rolled open at that meeting a copy of the Hebrew Scroll? Probably not. They probably would have spoken it in Greek. In fact, when Luke wrote it, he wrote it based upon his understanding of the Old Testament in Greek. And so when the Bible in the Old Testament written in Greek is translating those things, and then the New Testament begins to pick up those same words and apply those same words together, we should take note of that, right? We should take note of, okay. So Luke uses the same word eternal here, and the people who wrote the Old Testament in Greek used those same word to describe things that seemed that they would have perpetual existence, and they don't. And I think it's because of this. This word here matches very closely with what Jesus just said earlier in verse 8, the sons of this age. And I'm not the guy who likes to do this, so no one pin me as this. I don't want to be pinned as this guy. I don't want to be pinned as the Greek guy. But the word there, when he says sons of this age, is aion. The word down here for eternal is actually a derivative of the same word. It's aionios. So you can see that same word is embedded in that same word right there. With the point being, what you and I usually think of as eternal has some truth value to it, right? When Jesus says unto eternal life, that is going to be an ageless life. It is going to go on forever. But eternal can be used and often is to describe things as they pertain to their age, right? In the Old Covenant, all of those things are perpetual. You don't get away from them. You don't get away from circumcision. You don't get away from the priestly garments. You don't get away from the Sabbath in the Old Testament, right? There's no excuse. You just don't get to throw out the card that says, not today. You don't get to do that. They're perpetually binding. But here, we see that it's being contrasted here. There are what seem to be old things that are about to pass away, and these new eternal dwellings that are about to come in. So I think what these eternal dwellings are dwellings that pertain to an age. And here I think this age is one that is looming in front of the disciples here. There is a coming age, an eternal age coming from them that is different from this one that's soon about to close. It's soon about to close. And it's called eternal, and it's going to be tied to that specific age. So, eternal right there, right? It's going to be perpetual, but the reason it's going to be perpetual is because it's bound to a specific age. It's bound to a specific period or a specific thing. And now dwellings. Dwellings. So I kind of made mention of this already here, but with this manager in the parable back here in verse 4, as I showed, he's hoping to be welcomed into people's houses. This is a typical word for house. It's just a regular house. And the same thing with him, just as he's the manager and he's being welcomed in to, or he's called the manager or the ruler of the house. It's the same thing with the word manager there. So you have just this idea of these normal houses, and within every single house you have a ruler of the house. You have a head of the household. And that's a specific word. But here, when you get down to verse 9, and he says dwellings, he uses a totally different word. A completely different word. And we have to take note of this because Luke doesn't use this word a whole lot. So for him to change course, for him to change action here, and the use of his word right here to describe these dwelling places, we ought to take note of it. And now I hope you're actually starting to hear some of the readings that were done as we had the Old Testament and the New Testament readings here. So as compared to the manager being received into people's houses, the disciples should be expecting to be received by friends into these dwellings, or what we could call better, tabernacles. Tabernacles. This is the same word here used throughout the entirety of the Old Testament in Greek and in the New Testament to describe the tabernacling of God, to describe the tabernacle itself. But when that word is actually used often in the Old Testament, what was the tabernacle? Was that thing permanent? No. What did it give way to? It gave way to the temple. The tabernacle was a temporary dwelling place, almost a built-up fleshly place for them to enter into that would give way to a greater temple. But here, it's tied to the eternal. These tabernacles that they're going to be welcomed into are not some makeshift tabernacles like in the Old Testament that were going to be done away with. These are going to be ageless, age-abounding tabernacles that will pertain to an entirely different age. And if you think that is a weird thing to think of, here are some scriptures for this too, where this same word is used to describe this. In Matthew 17:4, Mark 9:5, Luke 9:33, and Hebrews 11:9, you get the same word used to describe the earthly tabernacle. And you think of Jesus' own words in John 1:14. What does it say that the Word came down and became? Flesh, and He what? Tabernacle. It's the verb form of the same word, but it is the same word, no doubt. It's the same word that He tabernacled among us. And if you paid attention to the quotation there in Amos, I want to read this again really quick. In the context of Amos 9, if you look at the beginning of chapter 9, it's about, the title has a great title. It's about the destruction of Israel, and then what's going to be included with this judgment, this destruction, is also going to be its restoration. So it's kind of confusing, because when Amos is talking about it, he's like judgment, 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 in that day, restoration. Same day. It's talking about the same event. And so you get this same language in Amos. In that day, I will raise up, same word, the booth or the tabernacle of David that is fallen. It's the same word in the Greek Old Testament. And then in Acts, they quote it in Acts 15 to talk about the fulfillment of that passage there in Amos, right? So when should we expect that thing to be fulfilled in Amos in the future? And the disciples, as they come together at the Jerusalem Council, conclude with the words of the prophets that God, in visiting Gentiles, unrighteous people, that is being fulfilled. And he says the same thing in 16 there in Acts 15. After this I will return and I will rebuild what? The tabernacle of David. Right, so there's going to be this rebuilding. And when we read at the end of all things there in Revelation 21, what is coming out of heaven is this city of God, this new Jerusalem, and a loud voice cries out to give interpretation of it, and he says, "Behold, the tabernacle of God is with man," the dwelling place. So what once used to be an earthly, temporary structure, the prophets in the Old Testament and the New Testament make very clear that the tabernacle of old will be rebuilt, but it will be rebuilt in an entirely new way, and that will be when unrighteous Gentiles enter into it. That's how you know it's being rebuilt. And guess what? This one is different and unlike the previous one. This one is eternal, and it is eternal because it is bound to an entirely different age. It is bound to a new heavens and a new earth. It is not bound to the old. So I think when we take both of these things together and we look back here at what is being said, I think it helps us make sense then of their perplexing action of people welcoming in the disciples into these eternal dwellings. So when Jesus says, I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when the money fails, when it comes crashing down, they, the unrighteous people, with this unrighteous wealth that you made dealings with, will receive you into eternal tabernacles. And church, I think the point of this is this. In light of the parable of the dishonest manager, in light of the fact that the Pharisees and the scribes were bickering because tax collectors and sinners were coming unto Jesus, he reminds them that just like the manager, Israel is soon being displaced, and you ought to be at least as shrewd, if not more shrewd than they are with their own generation, but you are to be shrewd in a way where you make friends with the unrighteous. You go out and you befriend those unrighteous people. You go out to the tax collectors. You go out to the sinners, so that when it all comes crashing down, you will be received into those eternal dwellings, those eternal tabernacles. Because verse 14, the Pharisees somewhat get this. It says the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things, and they ridiculed him. And then Jesus responds to them. He says to them, you are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. They think they're going to be the ones, like Amos says at the beginning of what Michael read. What did it say? Those people are going to drop down because they say, judgment's not coming upon us. These people think themselves to be right, be justified before God. And he says, for what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God. The parable is given for the disciples first and foremost to urge them to go out to the unrighteous and to make friends for themselves, so that when judgment befalls, they will be received into eternal dwellings by the ones whom were brought into those eternal dwellings because of them going to them. Right? These people are inhabiting these eternal tabernacles, and they're being welcomed in by them, seemingly because they befriended them. They befriended them, and now they are being welcomed in as their own wealth is failing, and they're being welcomed in to these eternal tabernacles. And you see this. You see why this would be a warning to them. Because you're kind of thinking then, okay, how does that tie in though with when Jesus is talking about then not having a love for money, make sure you're faithful with a little to be given a lot, and here it is. Think about the parable that follows this, that ends chapter 16, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Right? The parable of the rich man and Lazarus. The rich man enjoyed this life. He had all these riches. And Lazarus is not some stranger to the rich man. And how do we know that? Because it says that Lazarus, when he is talking, when it is describing where Lazarus was in his condition and in his state, it says that Lazarus in the manner of bad things as now being comforted. What does it describe him as? It describes him that he was there at the feet simply trying to get crumbs from the table of the rich man. That he desired, there in 21, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. These are not two random people being judged. One was good, one was bad. One had bad life now, and therefore he's getting the good life, and the good life now, and he's getting the bad life. It's to emphasize the fact that the rich man in his riches did not give to the poor, and therefore was a poor steward of the master's of his own possessions given to him. Brethren, the point is that in light of this, in light of the fact that this is going to be coming upon them, that is going to be, they're going to be removed for their poor management of the master's possessions, the disciples are being warned then of this very thing. Do not, in seeking to engage to make friends through unrighteous wealth, in doing so, be pulled into the love of money, because the love of money corrupts every time. That's what 10 and 13 is. 10 and 13, what seems to be these random statements, is now the two commands that Jesus gives for them to obey that. How ought they to make friends through unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they're received? They're to do two things. One, they're to be faithful in the little, that they would also then be faithful in much. Because the one who is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, and going out and doing the thing of making friends through unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you to the true riches? Who will entrust them to true riches? Who will do it? And the answer is they won't be. They won't be. Because if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? So he reminds them to be faithful in what they are given, so that they would then go and make friends through unrighteous wealth, through worldly activity, and thereby be received by the friends when it all comes crashing down. But then he also has the flip side of that, and he warns them, no servant can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. And it stands as a stark warning for them to not be drawn away in their time to the love of money. Money is a means in Jesus' command, but just like what comes later with the rich man and Lazarus, it can be to their own destruction if they fall in love with money and they forsake making friends through unrighteous wealth. It's a trap. It's like what Timothy says. It's a trap for people who want to become rich, because in a moment it devours them. And he's given them both of those things to warn them. To warn them. Do not give your devotion to money. Because that's not the command. The command is to make friends for yourselves, so that you would enjoy the result, that when it fails, you will be received into eternal tabernacles. And church, the point of this is that for them, that was something looming for them just on the horizon. Friends, for us, it's a reality that we experience. That the command would still go. The warning would still apply. Don't give yourself unto the love of money. Don't give yourself to the accumulation of worldly things. Don't give yourself to planning and to scheming and to being wise and to being shrewd simply to accumulate for yourselves. And as you do, you miss out on being welcomed in to that heavenly tabernacle at the end of days. The love of money corrupts and twists. But it also should cause us to think, church, just as the disciples were given a little and then given much later, we have been given much here as well, and we will have to give an account for our faithfulness in it. And church, listen, not just us, but the question comes to you. What have you been entrusted with? What are you doing with it? Are you doing with it the same things the disciples were commanded to do with it, and that was to go and to make friends? To go and to make friends, to have those dwell in the eternal tabernacle of God. Is that what you're doing with it? And ask yourself that. Because it's easy, just like the Jews of their day, to think that all the blessings came in and all the possessions come in, and they looked out on the worldly, and they looked out on the low, and they looked out on the despised. And what did that man say in his prayer as he's looking upon the tax collector? Lord, I'm thankful you didn't make me like that man and everything you've blessed me with. And who went home justified? The worldly man. The seemingly worldly man went home justified. It was the tax collector who bowed low before God. What are you doing with it? What are you doing with what the Lord has given you? Are you being shrewd and clever with what the Lord has given to you? And I'm not talking about, are you investing your money in a bank? Are you saving for your retirement? Are you making sure your kids get a good college fund? Friends, those things will fail you. Will they not? Do we have any hope that our children may experience the great childhood and upbringing and future that we did, given our own country? I mean, Lord knows we don't want our country to be judged, but it deserves to be judged. And if it is judged, brethren, it's going to fail. It's going to be just like in the disciples' days, looming judgment upon the nation, and people are fools putting their trust and their hope and their love in money, in their planning and their scheming, instead of using it to go out and to make friends for themselves by means of worldly activity. Friends, what is going to be more important for you in your planning with your things? Is it going to be the eternal tabernacling with God? Is it going to be dwelling with God forever? Is it going to be that the poor and the lowly and the nations who are despised and rejected, and yes, who do look like they have no God because they don't? Is it so that they would know Him? Is it so that they would come in? Because I fear that our riches are failing here in America. And friends, we need to get away from the idea that we ought to just build it up now in hopes that it's all going to maintain in the end. We need to be using it for what we're using it here for now and continue to do it. And that is to go out into the world. That is to go out into Las Vegas. That is to go out so that we would be commended. That would be to go out so that when it fails, we will not be shown to fail with it. We will be shown to enter into these eternal dwellings, brethren. So what are you doing with it, church? What are we going to do with it? What are we going to do with the things that we have been given? And no doubt we've been given very little here so far, but are we going to be faithful in doing it? Are we going to be faithful? Or are we going to look at other things? We're going to look at all the worldly activity that we can engage in for the world's sake and not for our own generation's sake. Let's pray.